Hola everyone. Thank you for joining the session. First thing first, I would like to thank to Associate Professor Cristina Sanchez for providing me with the opportunity to share my thought to all of you. My name is Eko Setiawang. I am from the Faculty of Pharmacy, the University of Surabaya, Indonesia. And in this session, I would like to share my presentation entitled Challenges and Strategies of Antibiotic Stewardship Program in Low and Middle Income Countries. This is the outline of what I'm going to present today. At first, I will briefly explain the background of why it is crucial to conduct stewardship program, which I will divide into three sections, including problem of AMR or antimicrobial resistance, driver of AMR, and barriers to access antibiotics. And then I'm going to be explaining a little bit more detail about the drivers of antibiotic prescription in the hospital of low middle income countries and stewardship program in low middle income countries. Following this, I will explain the effort to optimize the antibiotic exposure in specific ethnicity. In this case, I would explore about Indonesian people. And finally, I will close my presentation with the conclusion. Let me start with the background of my presentation. AMR is increasingly becoming a global emergency public health problem, causing high burden both clinically and economically. AMR is a leading cause of death around the world, with the highest burden in low resources settings. It should be emphasized, however, there are serious data gaps in many low-income settings. Therefore, the actual number of infections-related deaths could be suggested higher than what has been reported. A relatively recent published article in Lancet Journal estimates that there were around 4.95 million deaths associated with bacterial AMR in 2019, including 1.27 million deaths attributable to antimicrobial resistance. All the compared with all regional level, it has been estimated that the all-age death rate attributable to resistance highest in Western Sub-Saharan Africa with 27.3 deaths per 100,000 people. And the figure of all-age death rate attributable and associated to resistance in tropical Latin America, an area where Brazil classified to, is relatively similar to Southeast Asia, an area where Indonesian classified to. We can see in this slide that the death rate in Southeast Asia is around 54.8, and in tropical Latin America is around 63, while the death rate per 100,000 people attributable to resistance around 14.4 in Southeast Asia and 15.2 in tropical Latin America. To identify the level of seriousness of this figure, we need to compare this figure with the mortality rate caused by other diseases. It has been reported that the number of deaths attributable to antimicrobial resistance in Brazil and Indonesia is higher than 30,000, and also number of deaths associated to AMR in Brazil and Indonesia is higher than 130,000. What is the difference between the death attributable to AMR and that associated to AMR is the way the author conducting the analysis. When talking about attributable to AMR, which means the death number was compared with infection caused by the susceptible pathogens. When talking about the death associated with the AMR, it means that the death number was compared with when no infection occurred. The number of AMR deaths in Brazil is higher than death from diabetes and kidney diseases, respiratory infection and tuberculosis, self-harm and interpersonal violence, digestive diseases, and chronic respiratory diseases. Similar to Brazil, the number of AMR deaths in Indonesia also placed at the top 5 cause of death. And the death caused by AMR in Indonesia is higher than death from digestive diseases, respiratory infection and tuberculosis, chronic respiratory diseases, enteric infections, and maternal and neonatal disorder. In addition to the incremental of mortality rate, the most cases of infection caused by the resistant pathogens, patients are relatively sicker, leading to prolonged hospitalization, ICU admission, and require more complex medical treatment. These three consequences may increase the cost of hospitalization per patient. Therefore, it could be predicted that if the number of patients infected with the resistant pathogen increase considerably, the national health expenditure will also increase. In this slide, we can see 5 major pathogens should be aware of in Brazil and in Indonesia. It seems that both Indonesia and Brazil are facing a great concern toward infection caused by the E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae, Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus pneumoniae, while Acinetobacter baumannii may not be a great cause of mortality in Brazil. This pathogen was found as one of the major pathogens causing mortality in my country, in Indonesia. In the other hand, there is not much death caused by Pseudomonas aeruginosa in Indonesia, but this is not the case with the Brazil, where Pseudomonas aeruginosa was found as one out of 5 major pathogens causing death in Brazil. It is worth noting that if the trend of AMR is continue, it is very possible that AMR will seriously jeopardize the progress of modern medicine because the development of new antibiotics will not adequately address the problem of AMR. Intervention is indeed needed to prevent the further development of resistance and the spread of AMR to the wider area. And the ideal intervention should be developed according to the drivers of AMR. Professor Alison Holmes and her team from the United Kingdom have identified 9 major drivers of AMR. And we can see here that the inappropriate use of antimicrobial is among the biggest driver of AMR that has been supported with the highest level of evidence. Even though the vast majority of antibiotic consumption occurs in the primary care setting and nursing home, it has been demonstrated that antimicrobial resistance is more prevalent in hospital setting. Therefore, appropriate intervention is essential to improve the prudent use of antimicrobial hospital setting in order to prevent the development of MTR. In addition to the inappropriate use of antimicrobials, we can see here subtherapeutic exposure of antibiotic inside of a patient's body also found as the major drivers of AMR. Effort to maintain the efficacy of currently available antibiotic in its local setting should be made in low middle income countries. It is worth noting that access to antibiotics could be very, very challenging in some area in low middle income countries. In this slide, we can see several barriers to access antibiotics in low middle income countries, including weak drug discovery, difficulty in market entry. Antibiotics are not affordable, especially the new one is very, very expensive and also unreliable supply chain. It is therefore, I really strongly encourage that stewardship activity in low middle income country is paramount important to be implemented. What is antibiotic stewardship program? Antibiotic stewardship program is a coherent set of collective daily action to promote using antibiotic responsibly. And the ASP has been widely implemented, especially in high-income countries, and it can help maximize the effort to decrease the rate of resistance and to contain the expenditures of antimicrobial consumption without compromising the clinical benefit. Understanding of what factors enable certain stewardship activities to be successfully conducted is really important. And one important facilitator to the success implementation of stewardship program is interprofessional communication and the good relationship between stewardship program team and the other healthcare team, mainly the prescriber, which is the physician. In this slide, we can see that different structure of stewardship activities was documented in the published literature, which may require different prerequisite facility and policy support to optimize the success implementation of such activities. Stewardship may include prospective audit with feedback, formulary restriction, development of therapeutic guidelines, and conducting therapeutic drug monitoring. Which one should be implemented in our country? Which one should be implemented in our local setting? It is really, really challenging to answer. Understanding toward the driver of antibiotic prescription in the hospital setting in low middle income countries could be helpful to navigate which activity should be implemented in low middle income country. Should we implement only one activity or we should combine different activity? If combination activities is needed, which one should be combined? It's really challenging to navigate without knowing the drivers of antimicrobial prescription in the hospital of low middle income country. I did a scoping review to capture the driver of antibiotic prescription in low middle income country. And I have published it in MDR journal. Studies conducted in countries classified as low and lower middle income and upper middle income countries as classified by the World Bank were included in my review. And the search strategy was undertaken using the PubMed database to identify health-related articles from database inception until the April 2021. And I use quite extensive, you can see here, I use quite extensive keyword here, and I combine each keyword with the Boolean operator N and R. And finally, I got 37 here, 37 study from 20 countries included in the final descriptive analysis. The full range of the driver of antimicrobial prescription in my scoping review was canvassed with the COMP framework. C stand for the capability, O stand for opportunity, and M stand for the motivation. The C and M domain represented all factors from the internal prescriber's factor, while the O represented opportunity or factors external of the prescriber. We can see here from the capability factors, limited awareness toward the problem of resistance was frequently cited as the contributing factors of over-prescribing antimicrobial prescription. In addition to the low awareness toward AMR problem. Other factors also cited in this table. I cannot explain one by one due to the limitation of the time, but we need to really pay attention that people from the low middle income country, especially the healthcare workers, may not have the data regarding the AMR, so they don't know the magnitude, the quantity of the resistant problem in each setting. That is why they have a very low awareness towards the AMR problem. I will continue the next slide. Regarding the opportunity, we can see here quite a lot external factors that can influence the prescribing patterns in the hospital. Resources factors influencing the prescription of antimicrobials I listed here, including unavailability of microbiology facility, unhygienic or unsterilized condition, lack of antimicrobial policy, patient's clinical condition at the point of the first medical contact, intake of antimicrobials prior the patient present to the hospital admission. In addition to this, prescribing behavior among other healthcare colleagues and hierarchy structure within the medical field were found as factors under social influence domain or in the O component. Antimicrobial prescribing in low-middle income country was greatly influenced by prescriber colleagues in the hospital. The perception to fit in with the peers may represent a culture of collectivism. In sync with this collectivism was the hierarchy structure that is commonly found in the medical profession, especially in the teaching hospital consisting of junior, in training, and senior medical staff. For junior prescriber, directive from their senior colleague will mostly dictate the antimicrobial prescribing pattern. The pressure on junior doctors to follow this directive may potentially be higher in low-middle income country due to higher power distance culture found commonly in this country. According to Hofstadter domain, countries with a relatively high score on power distance and low score in individualism in Hofstadter cultural domain are usually characterized by a strong hierarchy and sense of collectivism. We can see here in the table that both Indonesia and Brazil have a relatively high score on power distance and low score in individualism. What has been found in the literature regarding the influence of other colleague prescribing behavior and also the pressure to follow the direction from senior were also found in my country, in Indonesia. I'm not so sure whether it is also observed in your country, in Brazil. If you have time, would you mind to write your experience and share it to me? I really want to hear your experience and observation regarding the collectivism culture and also the hierarchy structure in your institution. Finally, in the M or motivation component, one finding should be highlighted in this table is that hospital-based physicians thought that over-prescription of antimicrobial or antibiotic would not result in any harm to the patients. Moreover, antimicrobial prescribing in the hospital was strongly driven by the motivation to help improve patient outcomes and to be seen to be proactive in providing patient care. Regarding the emotional aspect, another important finding in my scoping review that led the prescriber initiating antimicrobial therapy were in patients with a like a relatively bad clinical condition at the first medical contact and arriving from environment with poor hygiene, such as those living in low socioeconomic condition. For this patient, there is often limited access to tertiary healthcare facility, and this might potentially lead the prescriber, the physician, to try alternative medicine to cure their condition. Lead the patients to try alternative medicine to cure their condition before they go to the hospital. Therefore, it could be understood that the patients in low-middle income countries are more often relatively sicker at the first medical encounter compared to those in higher income country. For example, in my country, in Indonesia, the patient usually try to drink the herbal medicine and try to use alternative medication, alternative therapy, complementary therapy before they really go to the hospital. If they have already tried everything and the condition is not getting better, then they will go to the hospital. In this case, make patient come quite late to the hospital and make the condition is quite bad. What we can see from the COMP analysis, uh, like the antimicrobial prescribing behavior in the hospital is acquired and maintained by overarching internal and external prescriber factor. Some factors are also found in Indonesia, and in this couple of slides, I would like to share my finding when I did a survey in one referral hospital in my city, like quite a big hospital in my city. And my survey was conducted among 66 medical doctors, almost 80% of the medical doctors and at that hospital, and also 12 pharmacies in that hospital were also included in the survey. There are several key findings in my survey. We can see here in this slide. First, problem of resistance in the hospital is perceived as less serious compared to the national problem. And it may be related to the perception toward the driver of AMR. Factors from outside hospital, including self-medication with antibiotic and poor patient adherence towards the medication, were perceived by the physician as the major contributor to the AMR compared to other intra-hospital factors. Second, more than 10% of respondents in my survey perceived that the antimicrobials were overused in the hospital. And if they being questioned about the stewardship implementation, such as the policy implementation, clinical guideline, majority would answer agree. And this should be expected because stewardship program in my country has been listed as the mandatory program in the hospital accreditation. And what should be anticipated is the program will not well function regardless the existence of the program is claimed in hospital, in Indonesian hospital. Finally, our respondents, especially, the pharmacists, had concern that stewardship program may trigger the conflict between healthcare professionals in the hospital. And it could be understood in a view that pharmacists in many developing countries, including in Indonesia, are not in a good position to provide advice on the appropriate use of antimicrobials. In terms of cultural context, again, we have the high power distance. If you remember the slide before, we have very high score in power distance. It means the very strict and very strong hierarchy culture in my country. In addition to the concern about the interprofessional communication, stewardship program was perceived by more than 70% of physicians or medical doctors as a barrier to usual practice in their field, an approach that may potentially limit their autonomy, and also a practice that may break hierarchy consultation etiquette in a particular specialty. According to Hofstede, again, if you remember, in my country, we have very low individual score. It means that we have very strong collectivist culture. And in a collectivist society, people's self-image is more representative of a we rather than I. It is therefore concern of breaking consultation etiquette in a particularly specialty was raised by the prescriber in my research. Understanding the local context is essential to navigate the stewardship activity, to navigate what stewardship activity should be implemented. Now, I would like to present what stewardship activities been implemented in low middle income countries and what should be anticipated after implementation. Give me a second. In my scoping review, I include 65 published articles in the final descriptive summary to address what stewardship program have been implemented in low middle income countries. Excuse me, because my battery is running low. I need to plug in the charger. Give me 2 minutes. Sorry for stopping for a while. I will continue. In my scoping review, I included 65 published articles to address and to capture what stewardship activity have been implemented in low middle income country and what outcome are resulted in terms of antimicrobial consumption, microbiology, and clinical outcomes. Most of study in my scoping review were conducted in a single center and were conducted in tertiary or university hospital, which could be referred as a relatively rich resources hospital. Only 3 studies conducted in the rural or district hospital. So we really have a concern that the gap between very rich resources and district hospital, because the resources is totally different. And unfortunately, the evidence come from rich resource hospital. My scoping review also summarized a range of stewardship activity being implemented in the low middle income country. And it seems that hospitals in low middle income countries tend to emphasize on the effort to limit the use of antimicrobials through implementing restriction or conducting audit with the feedback. No any study incorporated dedicated pharmacokinetic monitoring and dosing optimization strategy based on pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic or PKPD principles as part of the stewardship activity. Positive outcomes were indeed documented after the implementation of stewardship activity, including decremental of total antimicrobial consumption and cost, and no significant difference in terms of mortality rate before and after stewardship program. Compared with its impact on antimicrobial consumption and clinical outcome, the impact of hospital-based stewardship program on microbiological outcome was less reported among the included study. So you can see here, if the reason of being conducted stewardship activities about the AMR. But actually in real life, we don't have much data about the AMR, the effect of ASP activity, the effect of ASP implementation to the AMR. So it is really challenging from the perspective of the prescriber to see AMR as the serious problem in the hospital without such like a very strong data about AMR intra-hospital. What should be anticipated? That some study in low-middle income country indicate the shifting prescribing behavior in the hospital setting. It is clearly recorded in one qualitative study that hospital-based physician would prescribe alternative antimicrobial as the consequences of restriction of certain antimicrobials. Therefore, incremental consumption of non-restricted antimicrobials should be expected, as also described in some study in my scoping review. In general, increased consumption were found amongst antimicrobials commonly referred as the frontline empirical therapy of infection syndrome, including amoxicillin, amoxicillin clavulanic acid, quinolones, and piperacillin tazobactam. In addition to the shifting prescribing behavior, another concern regarding the hospital-based ASP implementation in low-middle income country is the remaining problem of unnecessary antimicrobial prescription. If you link again with the couple slides before about COMP, we can understand why physicians try to give antibiotics regardless it is infection or not infection, because patients come to the hospital quite sicker, quite in a bad condition. So they try to give everything to save the patient, and antibiotic was perceived as one of the best solution to save the patient life. What we can learn from this scoping review is that the effort to limit the use of antibiotics in the hospital may not always result in the optimal effort to combat the dwindling problem of AMR. Because we can see here the shifting prescribing behavior, the remaining unnecessary antibiotics. Therefore, effort to limit the use of antimicrobials should also followed by the effort to optimize the exposure of antibiotics for its patients. This is the outcome used in the stewardship program, as I explained earlier in the previous slide. The clinical outcome was reported, but antimicrobial resistance not much reported. And what should be anticipated, because we can see here that suboptimal or underexposure of antibiotic inside of patient's body also considered as the major driver of AMR. So we need to optimize the exposure of frontline antibiotic for each individual patient, especially knowing that after stewardship activity, we still find prescriber change the prescribing behavior to other like a broad spectrum antibiotic. And also we notice that still we have remaining problems of unnecessary antimicrobial prescription. So what can be done to optimize the exposure of antibiotic is conducting like PKPD approach, PKPD study, pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic study to optimize the dose of antibiotic, especially the frontline antibiotics that we usually use as the first contact to the patients. And as of course, identify the pharmacokinetic profile of local people, like in Indonesia, for example, identifying the PK profile of some frontline antibiotic can be considered as the key stone, key point, key step to optimize the exposure of antibiotics. In this slide, I will share my experience in conducting pharmacokinetic study. And in this case, levofloxacin, and I will also try to canvas the all reported PK parameters in the published literature and place my finding together with all the finding of other paper. In my study, I included 26 patients and 124 blood samples. I used P-metric thanks to Prof. Christina, who the one who teach me how to run the P-metric. And as the target, I use free fraction of AUC 24 over MIC more and equal to 80. My finding is presented here. The clearance in my population in Indonesian patient is quite low, 1.12, 1.12. And also P quite okay, 27.6. And similar to other paper, levofloxacin was best characterized as two-compartment model, and the renal function represented as estimated glomerulus filtration rate calculated with the CKD equation was found as the major component for the clearance. After conducting the PK study, I did the dosing simulation, and we can see here that this dosing simulation was conducted with the highest dose up to 1,000 milligram per day, and against the MIC of less equal to 0.5, acceptable PTA was achievable. Acceptable PTA defined as PTA more and equal to 90%. And against MIC more equal to 1 milligram per liter, acceptable PTA was difficult to be achieved. So giving 1,000 milligram of levofloxacin with different dosing interval according to renal function can maximize the likelihood of efficacy for adult patients, especially against the MIC more than 1 milligram per liter. The information about PTA would provide useful information with respect to dosing recommendation in situation where MIC is available. When no MIC value is available, presenting the likelihood of an antimicrobial dosing regimen attain priori PK/PD target against the MIC distribution, known as FTA, would provide useful direction for empirical treatment. In this slide, I would like to show you the finding of my study and other PK study on levofloxacin. The value of clearance may not always be the same. If we can see here, may not be the same. And the discrepancy of clearance of levofloxacin with other study could be explained by the difference in eGFR across the study. Talking of renal function, there are lots of factors could influence the value of renal function. And one of the major factors is the severity of infection or the clinical condition. It should be emphasized, as I explained earlier, that the health-seeking behavior of Indonesians might influence the severity of the diseases. In my country, again, people are likely to try herbal medicine or alternative therapy before going to seek the help from the healthcare professional. As a result, they may come at the hospital in a relatively severe condition. Therefore, the value of clearance of levofloxacin in my study is a bit lower compared with other study. So, what have been recommended in other study, like the dosing levofloxacin in other study, may not always be applicable in every situation. In this point, I would encourage you all to do the pharmacokinetic profile to identify the pharmacokinetic profile of commonly used antibiotic in Brazil for local people, because I do believe the health-seeking behavior of Brazilian people are also quite different from other countries, and many factors could affect the pharmacokinetic profile of antibiotic. This is the end of my presentation. I would like to conclude my presentation. So, hospital-based stewardship activity in any country, in specific local, should be a local setting, should be structured with the regards to the availability of resources in the local setting. Uh, and we should also take into account the concerns surrounding the power hierarchy among health professionals, clinical autonomy, and prescribing ethics. With regards to the concern of shifting prescribing behavior, there is the need to optimize the dose of commonly used antimicrobial, not only for Indonesian, but I also suggest for the Brazilian hospitalized patient according to the PK profile of the Brazilian patient. The PK of antibiotic in a specific ethnicity could be different. We have to remember, could be different from those reported in previous published literature. That is why what has been recommended in the other paper may not always be applicable in our setting. In addition to the implementation of stewardship activity by limit the use of antimicrobials, conducting pharmacokinetic study, and also to optimize the dose of antimicrobials could be suggested as a key step in decreasing the dwindling problem of AMR. Once again, stewardship activity in low-middle income countries should be structured not only to limit the use of antibiotics, but also to optimize the exposure of antibiotics according to the pharmacokinetic of local people. Thank you for your attention, and I do really apologize for stopping for a while. Thank you.